Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. Hope everyone's having a great summer, maybe getting some travel in, relaxing a bit. You know, the summer's interesting. The break, it's nice, but honestly, it's a little bit too much of a break for my taste. I'd prefer if maybe there was a little bit more going on in the art world. But soon enough, things will reopen. We're just over a month away from the Armory in New York and Free Soul, and then we're back in full swing through the end of the year with Miami. In this week's episode of the podcast, I'm joined by Emeline Salama-Caro, director of the Robert Indiana Legacy Initiative. The initiative was founded by her family in 2022 after the artist's passing, and it plays an important role in preserving and promoting the breadth of Robert Indiana's artistic legacy. In our conversation, Emeline shares why the initiative was created, how exactly it differs from a traditional artist estate, and how they're working to deepen the art world's understanding of Indiana beyond his famous love sculpture. We also talk about the challenges of managing a legacy after an artist's death, how Indiana's public artworks have shaped his reputation, and how the initiative is reintroducing his broader practice to collectors and institutions. Plus, we highlight his current exhibition at Pace Gallery in New York. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Emeline, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Adam. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Absolutely. Well, we're excited to have you on to learn more about the initiative and better understand how you're managing and promoting Robert Indiana's career and legacy. So your family founded the Robert Indiana Legacy Initiative in 2022, a few years after the artist's death. For listeners who may not be familiar, can you explain what exactly the initiative is and how does it differ from a traditional artist estate?
Sure, absolutely. So Indiana passed away in 2018. And prior to that, my father, Simon Salama-Caro, had been working with him as his exclusive representative for many years. This dates back to the late 80s, when they had first met in 1987. And they had worked for many years, and Indiana had also asked my father to author the catalog raisonné for him. So there was already the background of the expertise and the knowledge of the artist's work, combined with having, been a part of many projects that had taken place with the artist, whether it was exhibitions, working with galleries, working with museums, working on projects to realize artworks, the sculpture series that Indiana had returned to post the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And so when Indiana passed away in 2018, it sort of made natural sense as there were all these questions about, who was going to be the custodian or guardian of Indiana's legacy, and him not having any family members. We assumed this role, given the expertise and knowledge of the artist's work. And so we felt that it was the right thing to do. In 2022, we established the Robert Indiana Legacy Initiative in order to simplify and, provide the transparency of what we do. And so we are the leading entity dedicated to preserving and promoting the artistic legacy for the late American artist, Robert Indiana. And with the work that we do, although we are not technically a traditional artist estate, we handle many of the responsibilities that would, fall within that role. And so we maintain a collection and archive of Robert Indiana's art. We encourage and support exhibitions and public installations of the work. We work with scholars to develop research on Indiana's life and his career. We manage the website, which was originally founded in 2013, which is dedicated to the artist's work. And that website now houses the catalog raisonné, which was launched online in 2023. And that was a project that had been started in 1998. And so it had taken quite a while, and we're very pleased, obviously, that we have that now available, which is part of everything that we're doing, which is to really help to share information on the artist's work and to provide background. So given the relationship that my family had and, my father's long-standing work in, dedicating a large portion of his career to promote and preserve Indiana's work, this felt like something really important for us all to do. We genuinely care about the work and we understand it. And, our family was entrusted to take on this. So it's been really enjoyable since 2022 to have that.
Yeah, it's really great to hear all of the different ways in which you've been promoting his legacy. So the final years of Indiana's life and the aftermath of his passing were marked by intense legal scrutiny and allegations from multiple parties. I remember following along in the art press. Now that a settlement's been reached, how do you reflect on that period, and what do you think the art world maybe misunderstood about what was happening at the time?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was definitely a very challenging time for our family and anyone that cared about the artist's work and of course, the artist. We go back to 2018. There had been a gradual progression of exhibitions that had been taking place to expand on Indiana's work. The Whitney had hosted a retrospective in 2013. And then we started to see a good dialogue that was happening with curators and directors in the institutional world. And then 2018, there was a fantastic exhibition at the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, New York. And this was a moment that should have received, great attention, accolade. And instead, it was obviously drowned out by the legal situation because Indiana had literally passed away. This case had been filed, which was actually a necessary action that was put in place to protect the integrity of the artist's work and his legacy, which was important to him and obviously to us. And, instead of having this wonderful moment, Indiana passed away literally the next day after that was filed. And so sort of then you saw a tumult of all these articles that were pouring out, and instead of celebrating the artist's life and, the accomplishments achieved, I mean, he created, one of the most iconic images of 20th century art. You have this legal situation, which in turn created a lot of unnecessary confusion. There was misinformation about who was who and, what entity was this one. And, what didn't help was journalists were, acting quickly to write before they were really doing full research. And so at the end of the day, what had been a necessary action to, protect the artist's work and obviously the legacy had been sort of overwhelmed by all of that. And so I think, the most important aspect that we wanted to share with people is that we were really fighting for protecting that part of Bob's legacy and his work. And, our commitment remained steadfast. And we were very lucky to have some good friends and allies who cared enough to reach out and share messages of support. But it was a difficult time. Indiana was a great artist, and the depth of behind his work has often been misunderstood or overlooked in many ways. He has inspired generations of younger artists, whether it's, consciously or subconsciously, and it just wasn't right what had happened to him. And, despite what people feel, no one deserves at the end of your career to sort of that to be what everybody's speaking about. So it took time and we fought for, what was right, and we were happy to be successful with that. And yes, we've now created, a better path forward. And so while these challenges created some initial uncertainty, the Legacy Initiative obviously is focused on ensuring clarity and confidence in Indiana's work. And that's through the scholarship, exhibitions, providing transparent documentation. And so, for example, the catalogue resume, which I've mentioned earlier, that's on our website, that provides the ability for collectors and scholars and institutions to have definitive information on Indiana's artworks. And so that was a very positive development that came out of all of it. And, we feel now, obviously, that we're in a better place, and now we can concentrate on or the more positive aspects of the legacy building.
So the legacy initiative that your family founded, it's maybe somewhat atypical in that it's independent of the artist's estate, but deeply involved in scholarship and promotion, as you've discussed. Do you think this kind of initiative could be a model for other artists after they pass away? Or do you see it as something unique to Indiana's circumstances?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And it's funny because we often, when we're engaging with people in the art world, they will often comment to us on the side that they wish that many artists had something like us to be able to do the work that we do, because there is that passion and that commitment and sort of deep respect. And, I think it's helpful when there is one person who believes in an artist or believes in an artist's work when other people don't see it. And, it's only when you have someone in that position who commits to it that then that artist's work will persevere, right? Will continue to exist. I don't know I'm not sure if we are unique in our approach in legacy building for an artist, because obviously there's been situations previously when a dealer or an author of a catalog raisonné who's the expert has been the person who's helped to build or expand on an artist's legacy after they died. But I do think that, when you have an artist who does not have family or a relative or someone who's going to choose to carry on as a guardian for their legacy, it's really helpful to have someone who's very passionate about the work. And we are lucky because we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of the choices of projects we get to work on. I think it can be sometimes difficult when you have an estate and it depends on the setup. If there are family members and, people are not always aligned or they're sort of infighting, in this situation, our family, we're all very aligned about the core principles of what we do. And at the end of the day, our mission is to continue the work that our father had, spent a long part of his career building. And, it's really nice because we are the next generation. We are thinking of ways in which we can connect Indiana's work with, a younger or different audience. And so it's helping to continue that. And for us, we've had very positive feedback about what we do. So it makes us feel good about the work. And, we remain committed to sharing Indiana's own voice and his sense of connection with history. Underneath it all, we are just, we're custodians and we have a distinct opportunity to share Indiana's brilliance as an artist, with the world. And we take that seriously, and it's what gets us going and excites us.
So I want to ask you a little bit about Indiana's work, and I think a great place to start is actually with the love, sculpture and design. I'm sure most of, if not all of our listeners recognize that image in their minds, but what's the origin of the love design? I imagine most aren't actually familiar with the story.
Sure. It's such a good question. Thank you for asking. I think a lot of people, when they think of the love, they obviously immediately see it in its iteration as the sculpture or sculptural form. And love for the artist actually goes back to the mid-1950s, where in his poems, he had actually typed out on a sheet of paper the love in the stacked format, but it didn't have the tilted O, obviously, at that point, because it was a typewriter. But it was in 1964, Indiana had set about to send cards to friends and acquaintances in the art world. And he had this idea, the square format to him was a very important shape. And he had this idea to take the word love and put it into the stacked format, but tilt the O. And he always said that was a reminder of sort of the fragility of it all. And so it started in the form of a card, and then he worked on a series of paintings, which began in late 1964, early 65. And then in 1966, he made the first love sculpture. But something that's really stood out for me when I think about love and sort of the image and how we see it today versus what it must have been like to see it back in the 1960s, is how it's become this icon and this part of cultural zeitgeist, which, it didn't exist. When you think about artists in the 1960s, Indiana's peers who are closely associated with pop art movement, and, he's considered a founding member of, they were taking images that already existed, whether it was a Coca-Cola bottle, whether it was a street sign, whether it was, an image of a celebrity like Marilyn Monroe. And the love, it didn't exist until Indiana created it. So I think with the brilliance of that work, and sort of the enduring power of it, this was a self-created image, and it's now become part of our cultural psyche. Like, we just can't imagine that it never did, that it didn't exist like that. And I just always marvel at that and the brilliance of it. And it's something that we are obviously sharing information with people as and when they're learning about the work. But I always think that's an interesting component to the enduring power of his work. The fact that he was able to create something that didn't exist, and now it's as if it had always been there. And I think it's just great.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You don't really think about love as being created by Robert Indiana. You sort of think about it as always existing in our memories, but it is something, as you said, that he did create. So many of Robert Indiana's most iconic works, including Love, are experienced as public art, right? In cities around the world, the sculptures and the work is so accessible to so many. How do you think this accessibility has shaped his legacy? And what role does the initiative play in preserving or expanding that public exposure?
I'm happy that you're asking me this question, because it's true. Most people, when they think of Indiana, they obviously think of sculpture and the works that they've seen in public environments. And having works on public display around the world has obviously been a significant part of shaping his legacy, because it creates a relationship to the artwork that obviously feels approachable. One usually encounters art in a museum or a gallery or in an artist studio, but that access point is a much more formal setting. But seeing an artwork installed in a public space, it allows a wider audience to engage and get to know the works in a natural environment. And, that's something that Indiana was himself very fond of. So with Indiana sculpture, because that's what most people have seen outdoors, interacting with the works is all about the space it's placed in. And, when people do experience his artwork in those kind of settings, it inspires them to share in the magic of the image and saturation of the color and the volume. And these works become part of their own memories or their own journeys. And I mean, I've noticed that the works, they really enhance the natural environment they're in. For example, Indiana's number sculptures, I love to see those, and I love to see how, audiences will sort of interact with them in different ways. And, we're lucky because we manage a collection of Indiana's works, so we can partner globally with, public programming initiatives. And this was something that was very important, as I mentioned, to Indiana, because as a child who grew up with very little access to art, he always wanted people to be able to have an entry point to his work. And so having his work on view publicly was definitely treasured by him. He was very fascinated with changing the way we perceive ordinary subject matter or ordinary objects. And, for example, like taking the numbers, like something that's so universal to everybody, and, creating these very large scale, voluminous pieces and having that interaction, it's quite special. And so, he was very involved in the outdoor exhibitions when he was alive, and his artworks have become kind of like landmarks and a point of interest. And, to me, that's a sign of their universal and enduring power. As a segue, like one of the main reasons why Indiana had focused on developing his edition sculpture between the 1960s and the mid 2000s, is that. And, for him, the idea of someone being able to have access to his work to inspire reflection made him happy, and having his work be part of the American landscape, which is something that's so much part of his, his earth, and around the world, excited him. And, he always said the larger the scale, the sculpture, the better. I think, going back to what you said, what has really helped his work endure past the moment that it was created is that the themes addressed in his work are not only very powerful themes, but they're also enduring. They're themes that relate to our lives. And, his expansive career has sort of revealed an artist who has harnessed these simple words and, the graphic immediacy of vernacular signage to explore fundamental issues facing humanity. So, we have love and we have death, we have sin, forgiveness, and, these are themes that are still very relevant today and relatable to. And, when you see the sculptures put into an environment where there is interaction with a wider audience, it's really fantastic. We worked on a project which is coming to my mind recently with Rockefeller Center in New York. And it was really one of the most emotionally moving ones I've seen to date because of the reaction I was seeing with the audience to the works. We're based in New York City, and the city has no shortage of great things to see. But when we installed Indiana's monumental 12-foot Love and the 8-foot Number sculptures, it was amazing to see how different groups of people were interacting with the works, but, creating it was bringing them together. It was bringing people together to experience something beautiful from what could be perceived as just an ordinary subject, words and numbers. And in my opinion, I feel like this is a gift that, Bob has left for us all to enjoy. And, he often commented on the reasons why he chose, words, obviously because of his passion for language and poetry. And, numbers were also, a universal language, something that we could relate to, but very personal to him because, numbers were like a constant for him as a child because he moved around a lot. And, I see all the time how people connect with those works and they gravitate towards them. They want to be near them. They want to touch them, although, of course, we try to advise not to. And, they become part of their lives and their memories. And so I think that, that's something very special and, helps Indiana's work to live on, really.
Absolutely. And so you touched on this a little bit, but one of the unique challenges of promoting the work of a deceased artist is that there's no new output. And of course, the artist is no longer there to speak about the work or participate in the dialogue in any way. How do you keep Robert Indiana's work active and relevant in today's art world where attention often shifts to the new? And related to that, how do you introduce his broader practice to collectors who may only know Love or the Number sculptures or some of the others that you mentioned and aren't as familiar with the depth of his work?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And one we're often thinking about as well as we're actively continuing to think of the different projects that we can work on. Indiana's work remains deeply relevant to contemporary art dialogue, particularly in its exploration of American identity and language and social commentary. Indiana himself, we're fortunate, he was very verbal about, there were many artist statements on his work, and he did participate in the 60s and 70s while he was living in New York. And, we have, fortunately in the archives, we have a lot of information in which we can, when we're rethinking how to place Indiana today in contemporary society, his work, there's a lot of parallels too. I mean, when you think of Indiana's work now and the themes that he was addressing and grappling with, it's very much, there's a parallel to today. I mean, if you were to take a newspaper article, the front page of a newspaper from the 60s or early 70s and compare with today, obviously there would be a journalistic style change, but you would see similar themes. There's sort of like high anxiety with what's going on socially and politically. And, although Indiana didn't set about to be a political artist, there's so many aspects of the work that address, what was happening socially and politically in America in the 60s. And I think that, as we start to develop, as we continue to develop, exhibitions that we've worked on, like, Robert Indiana, The Sweet Mystery, that was presented in Venice last year in partnership with Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and the exhibition that's currently on view right now with Pace Gallery in New York. We've introduced audiences to the rich symbolism and storytelling and historical depth of his work. In addition, we are continuing to support scholarly research. We're working right now on a monograph, which will be the largest to date for the artist. And we're working with, 3 historians who haven't contributed on Indiana's work yet. And, these are contemporary voices who, again, once they're starting to learn about the artist's work and go in depth, are finding it very interesting related to now. And there's also other artists who are working today who have been introduced to Indiana's work and finding connections. And so this is something that is really important to the Legacy Initiative, and that we will continue to do. We will continue to work with museums, and we'll continue to work with the gallery, so that we can also ensure that Indiana's full artistic range is exhibited and studied. Because you're right, while Indiana's market has been historically centered around love, we are seeing a shift as institutions and collectors and scholars take a broader view of his contributions. As I've mentioned, his work, it does resonate with current movements, and, there are artists who are obviously engaging with similar themes of identity and history, and whether it be political or social themes. And so it really helps to position, when you start to bring Indiana into that mix, it really positions him within this, canon of post-war American art. And that's why, we continue to do what we're doing, because it's true. It is difficult when an artist is obviously no longer living, and, most people want to hear from the artist. So we are always thinking of different ways. And unfortunately, we were left Indiana when he passed away. We have in the archive a lot of information and a lot of artist statements. So that's very helpful.
And so, as you mentioned, there's an exhibition right now of Indiana's work at Pace Gallery in New York. It's on view until mid-August. The show is called The American Dream. I had a chance to see it earlier this summer and really enjoyed it. But for our listeners who haven't visited yet, and maybe they're traveling to the city over the next few weeks, or if they're living in the city and just haven't made it over, can you tell us a little bit more about the show?
Yes, I'd love to. So we were very excited to partner with Pace last year. We have, reunited Indiana back with the gallery. I don't know if you know the history. Funnily enough, Pace, Arnie Glimcher, had actually shown Indiana's work in 1962 when he had opened his first gallery in Boston. So it was a really nice way to reconnect Indiana with the gallery. And the exhibition, which opened up in May, is called Robert Indiana, The American Dream, which we've been fortunate to work with Mark and Arnie and all of the team on. This is, one of the most significant themes in Indiana's work, which is that of the American dream, which serves as an autobiographical reflection and a profound commentary on the American dream itself. So it talks about sort of the optimisms and the aspirations, but also the challenges and contradictions. And given today's social and political landscape, these themes are, as I mentioned before, more relevant than ever. And it offers new generations a chance to engage with Indiana's poignant reflections on American identity, because at the end of the day, all of the work that Indiana completed is autobiographical. And, he had when you start to delve into who Indiana was and go back and reflect on his early childhood, and it's quite interesting. It's an interesting path to go on, because it brings you back to sort of a more historical notion of the artist. I mean, I'm a history major originally, and what I love about Indiana's work is that it's always forcing me to research and to look back and challenge me to find out more information. And, that's something today also that we are, I think, lacking a little bit in, which is that sort of thirst for knowledge about history. And it's something that's really important, because in order to understand where we are today and how we got here, we have to go back and look at history. And, Indiana was a big supporter of that idea. And so the exhibition at Pace, which I was really, pleased for it to happen now, brings together major examples of painting and sculpture, which were created by Indiana beginning in the early 1960s and then developed through subsequent decades of his career. And they all these works that have been pulled together, they all reflect upon different themes, different series of Indiana's work that discuss that sort of like what was happening post-war in America. And so if you have a chance, the exhibition will be on view until August 15th. And there is an installation of the number sculptures in 6-foot scale in core 10, which look fantastic on the terrace. So if any of your listeners are in New York and want to go see the show, it'll be there for about another 3 weeks.
Perfect. Well, I definitely recommend our listeners check out the show if they haven't already. Emeline, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and chatting with us about Robert Indiana, as well as the Legacy Initiative. And if our listeners want to learn more about the initiative, what's your website?
Thanks, Adam. It's www.robertindiana.com.
Great. Thanks again.
Thank you.